Like if you had a 0% churn rate, then that business is going to just stack and compound every day for the rest of eternity. Like that would be the best business the world has ever seen. So there's this fine line between a business where it has 0% churn, keeps stacking, compounding. You don't even need that much growth and it compounds kind of infinitely, or the business where essentially you have to restart every month. You can now spend more than your competition on acquisition, which means you can acquire customers faster because you have more revenue on the back end because you're solving kind of this involuntary churn problem. They blame you, and generally for good reasons. Like, okay, the customer sees it. I was like, oh, my card worked. I just made a purchase like 10 minutes ago. Why did it fail on this? Are you doing something sketchy as a business? Like, no, I'm going to go to somewhere that I trust. I think this is arguably one of the most exciting things happening in this space is the ability to tailor retry strategies around the error code that is returned. So how you treat an insufficient funds is going to be different than how you treat a generic decline. And that, I think, is where things get really, really interesting.
Today, my guest is Philip Pages, the CEO of Redux Payments. We discussed involuntary churn from different perspectives. Why it's still the biggest trend and the biggest problem in 2025. Why, with new technologies such as network tokens for cards or alternative payment methods and open banking, we're still having a lot of payments declines, and why we need intelligent retry logic to solve it. We talked about different retry strategies that merchants can implement to reduce involuntary churn. And of course, we shared some practical advices for merchants that they can implement right now to improve their payments performance. With this, please welcome Philip Pages. Hi, Philip. Thank you so much for joining Payments FM.
Hey man, I'm excited. We've been chatting a bit on LinkedIn and off LinkedIn, so excited to finally get a chance to face-to-face have a conversation. I know we're both very deep in the payment space, so this is fun for me.
Let's talk about the subscription churn. I know that's the topic you're the most excited about. Many experts think that churn is the biggest challenge in subscription businesses, and I know you build a business around it. So let's talk about why it's really like the most interesting topic for you, and why do you think it's such a pain point for subscription businesses, for like companies who provide any sort of recurring payments?
Yeah, I mean, well, first off, I think it's just such a complex problem, and there's so much nuance to it, right? Like if you had a 0% churn rate, then that business is going to just stack and compound every day for the rest of eternity. Like that would be the best business the world has ever seen. And if you look at that, that's like the best business you've ever seen. And then the other side of that is like the world that I originally came from was e-commerce. So that's where you're selling a product and every month your revenue just goes to zero and you need to restart. So there's this fine line between a business where it has 0% churn, keeps stacking, compounding. You don't even need that much growth and it compounds kind of infinitely, or the business where essentially you have to restart every month. So if you're looking at the churn side of things, you want to get your churn, if you're a subscription business, if you're a SaaS business, you want to get that as close to zero as possible, because when you do, the level of compounding, the level of exponential growth, all these things really start playing in your favor. And that is why it's so interesting to me, because when you can get as close to zero or keep reducing, chipping away at that churn, you start seeing these huge exponential growth curves in businesses. And that's the part that I find so interesting. Like there's just so much that can be done. Marketing becomes more efficient and you can outspend competition and you can have a longer CAC payback period. And like all these things start playing into these businesses when you start reducing your churn lower and lower. I mean, it's one of those things that is kind of boring on the surface, but when you really understand the leverage behind it, it becomes something that is super interesting and something that I think every team should start thinking about fixing in a very serious way.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting problem. What do you think are the main reasons or like the main drivers for churn and for customers basically to like cancel subscription or just stop paying for these types of businesses?
Yeah, I mean, this is the nuance that a lot of people don't recognize is churn is kind of broken it into two parts. So there's the voluntary churn side. That's where someone doesn't want the product. They actively say, hey, I don't want this anymore. Please unsubscribe me. That's going to be 50%, 60% of churn. somewhere around that range. And then you have the other side of it where it's involuntary churn. That's where the customer wanted to stay, but they had a payment failure or they had something that caused their subscription to end prematurely without them having to raise their hand and saying, hey, I don't want this anymore. So it's kind of two distinctions on that. It's like one is active churn, and that's going to be either like bad acquisition, like you just overpromised on top of funnel or during the acquisition process, acquired these customers, they come in and say, hey, this is not what I was promised. Or maybe they got the value they needed and they were like, okay, I got what I needed, I'm out, kind of thing. Like there's so much nuance to like the active churn side of things where it can really be so many different factors. Like maybe your onboarding process isn't good, just like the voluntary churn side. The involuntary churn side is equally interesting, but I think it's nuanced, but also like pretty clear, like what the direction on that is. So when I say like involuntary churn, that's going to be like your payment failure. So if you have a Stripe dashboard, that's going to be that orange bar where it's just like, okay, this is how many payments have failed. This is how much revenue like you didn't collect. That is going to be that involuntary churn side. And studies, I mean, it varies company to company, but that's really going to be anywhere from like 20% to all the way up to like 50% of your entire churn is going to be involuntary. And like I'm sure we're going to dive deep into that, but that is a very interesting lever to pull because a lot of times historically, there's been a lot of under optimized ways of recovering these failed payments, recovering this involuntary churn side. And people generally just lump it all together. Oh, churn is churn. They're doing everything with their onboarding flows, their exit flows, all these things, but they completely ignore the other side, which has a huge impact, kind of runs behind the scenes and has the same positive compounding effects that like when you solve a failed payment, you recover that subscriber, they have their ongoing retention, their renewals. It's a very interesting issue, but it's also one that's not very well understood because of some of the complexities, because of maybe technological limitations that we're now able to explore deeper as technology improves.
It's a very interesting data point that you brought up, that involuntary churn is almost equal to voluntary churn. And it's very interesting to think about it. I'm thinking when I subscribe to some online digital media or a streaming service or like a newspaper, then I decided that not interested in this anymore, I'll cancel, and that would be calculated as voluntary churn. And you're saying that involuntary churn, basically the payments issue is like approximately is the same scale. Do you have maybe like an example? How big is actually like the churn problem in general? For example, if there is a product, like as a subscription service, like or like a box of the month, how big is involuntary churn in general can be for them? Just like from the side of like ROI, do they need to start looking into this? Is it like an urgent problem, or how big is the revenue is lost there? Do you have an example?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this varies business to business. On the upper side, I think the dream case scenario, right? Like best case scenario, we have had customers that we've worked with and the recovered payments is it boosts their ARR by like 8%. That's been like there were a lot of optimizations we could do. There was a lot of opportunity there. I think that is certainly the best case scenario. On the other side, though, you need to also understand the scale of your business to really determine whether this is a large issue for you. I think if you can kind of figure out a way to solve this with a very limited overhead kind of situation, just runs in the background, that is an ideal kind of implementation or thing that you should do. But let's take an example. Let's say you're a company, and we've seen examples where you have your best case scenario, you're boosting ARR by 8% plus. That's amazing. There's the other side where you can have these incremental revenue gains, but depending on the volume of your business, it can have very, very large impacts on it. Let's say you're a decent sized business, you're doing some volume. You're maybe recovering, let's say your recovery rate is 20%. So you're recovering $200,000 per month in payment failures, but you're losing $1 million in payment failures. If you're able to increase that from 200,000 to 250,000, so you go from a 20% recovery to a 25% recovery, you're now increasing your recovery rate by $50,000 per month. Over the course of a year, that's $600,000 on a very tiny improvement. Most businesses can increase their recovery rate from 20 to 25%. Like that is kind of table stakes to an extent. But then here's the other interesting point, right? if you are recovering that first transaction, so let's say you recover $50,000 in additional incremental failure revenue, you're not just recovering, let's simplify it even further. That $50,000 is made up of a bunch of $100 transactions. So if you were to lose that $100 transaction, you're not just losing $100. Let's say your customers stay on for an extra 6 months. You would have lost $600 in LTV by not recovering that initial film payment. So going back to our example of incrementally increasing your revenue from 200,000 to 250,000 in recovery, that $50,000 is actually closer to what is that? 50,000 times 6, $300,000 in additional revenue. But then that's for one singular month, and you have 12 months of that. The impacts are massive when you look at the LTV side of it. And if you're a very high volume business and you're increasing it by small percentage points, there's a lot of alpha, there's a lot of revenue there. But let's say you're not even doing $1 million in failures. Let's say we have customers working with us that are doing 100,000 in failures, and they're capturing $30,000 a month of that. So they're at a 30% recovery. If you go from a $30,000 recovery to a $40,000 a month recovery, your net lift is now $10,000 a month. And then if you do that over the course of a year, that's $120,000 in pure margin dollars in your pocket. But then you also have the LTV associated. So you take 120,000, you multiply that by 3 or 6 or whatever your LTV boost is. That's now hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is just pure dollars that we see all the time that are just kind of found and becomes a huge revenue source, because what that allows, it's not just the recovered payments. It's also now you can spend more on acquisition. You can, like Facebook, Meta, all these companies, like it's getting more expensive every year to acquire customers. Like that's the reality of it. I've been running companies since 2016. I remember when Facebook ads were super cheap. Now they're not. It's only going to get more competitive. So you need to start finding more ways to boost your LTV so you can improve your CAC payback period, your CAC to LTV ratios, all these things that you can now spend more than your competition on acquisition, which means you can acquire customers faster because you have more revenue on the back end because you're solving kind of this involuntary churn problem. So whether you're getting an 8% ARR boost or you're incrementally increasing your amount of revenue by 10,000 a month or 20,000 a month or 100,000 a month, like there's a lot of compounding benefits to the point where even if you don't hit a home run in the sense of like your ARR is blasting off, you're still making significantly more incremental revenue for something that's like not as much effort, I think, as most people think.
I like how you mentioned the orange bar in the Stripe dashboard. It sounds like you're very familiar with the Stripe dashboard and all this, like, and about like the analysis and declines. There is one interesting piece of data in a Stripe dashboard as well, is about some tools what Stripe can enable to prevent churn, right? Like an account updater, network tokens. And I believe the network tokens was such a hot topic during the last year and even this year when Visa, MasterCard, they're pushing merchants to enable network tokens. For some merchants, when I'm looking at the data, I see that in the Stripe dashboard again, that they do solve some problems and they increase the success rate. Do you think that with solutions like this, that we will eventually kind of like mitigate involuntary churn?
I think yes and no. As long as there are people in the mix, I think there's going to be card errors, there's going to be insufficient funds, there's going to be declines in that sense. I think what will likely be solved more so are some of the infrastructure or the technical issues. So the world of payments has historically not really been built to support subscription billing necessarily. There's a lot of technical inefficiencies and things like that, where the world is built for one-time payments, but recurring payments, things like that, like it is somewhat of a new kind of technology. I know we have to think, SaaS has been around forever. But historically, it's always been like these one-time payments. I still think we're in the very early stages of even the banks, and they're trying to figure out like, okay, how do we solve this? How do we build the technology to adapt to handle declines and things like that? I think it is something they're going to be working on. And whether tokenization or things like that are actually improving. I mean, you have Card Updater, which automatically updates your card whenever it fails. That's why this happened to me before. Like it's sometimes it's very convenient, but like, let's say my card is expired and then you somehow like they know your next card and like are able to charge the next one. And he's like, okay, you get continuity of service, you get to keep that service. That essentially is card account updater, and a lot of like subscription platforms are baking that in. And that's been great because like I've had issues where my card has expired, they don't have account updater, I lose the service, then I got to go through the whole rigmarole of, oh, my card, it's a lot. Sometimes it's okay, I'm gonna go like to a competitor kind of thing. So I do think they're going to probably minimize or at least kind of maybe reduce. But I do think there's going to be more issues that pop up and more cool things you can do. For example, even Stripe introducing payment orchestration at Stripe sessions literally like last month. There's a lot of cool things that I think are happening in payments, but it really is behind the scenes. I don't think involuntary churn is ever going to be fully reduced in this on an infrastructure layer or on the banking layer. I think that is going to be solved by point and shoot solutions. What some other people like orchestrators in the space are working on. I know I think you were interviewing the Gravy last, right? Where they were talking about orchestration and things like that. I think there's so much interesting technology coming out around this problem. I think it can be solved, but I think it's going to come from like individual solutions that are very, very focused on a very specific problem and maybe layering in more complexities around that. Because I do think like each of these problems is pretty complex to solve. And if you can really focus on one thing and be the best at that, you can maximize how much you recover or how much you reduce on like the authorizations and things like that. There's a lot to unpack. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's kind of like my general ramblings on that.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense. I have a follow-up on that. It looks like the industry is shifting towards cardless payments. We see some great examples internationally, right, with UPI or PIX, like in India or Brazil. Do you think that alternative payment methods, they will solve involuntary churn problem?
Yeah, I mean, there's some issues where it's like if you don't have funds in your account, you don't have funds in your account, and there's ways around that. If it's flagged as a fraud transaction or a do not honor, if you've lost your card, or maybe it's a cardless transaction. Yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting question. What are your thoughts on that? How do you think about that space? Because obviously you're very plugged in and on it. Where does your head go? Because I'm always interested to understand kind of like, yeah, where's your head at on that?
I think it's a very interesting topic. I think definitely there will be a balance. I think some lines will go away, like a card expired, right? Because there is no card, nothing to expire. In bank accounts, they do not expire. But I think some declines, they'll still be there. What you mentioned, like if the person don't have funds, they don't have funds. So there is nothing you can do about it. And so I think there will be some declines that we'll still have, but maybe it will be less of something we know, but I'm sure there will be new declines that they will be there. Last week, actually, Google introduced the agentic checkout process. Basically, when Google will be making the payment for you, right? Like a Google AI will be kind of like completing the transaction for you. I'm also curious how it will affect the payments industry if we'll see the new types of declines or new types of dispute codes. So yeah, I think there are a lot of things are boiling there, and we'll see some like new interesting implications from these trends and how they affect the payment side. I have another question for you about the retries in general. And I'm looking at this from the customer perspective and from the customer experience. If I was not super sure about the subscription service, or maybe I did a free trial and then they asked me to add a credit card, I maybe have a credit card with a very low balance on it, so I'll just add this card to the service. Or maybe I try the first month, but I'll be not putting funds on this card just to keep the subscription only for like a month or something like that. And then my next payment was declined. And then I assumed that I'm done with the subscription, right? So they tried to charge me. I didn't put funds. So I'll put funds on this card for like another reason. And then retry logic will hit and they'll charge my card and they'll continue this subscription. So as a customer, I would be a little bit upset. I would be like, yeah, okay, I started this service, but when they tried to charge me, didn't put funds actually on purpose because I didn't find, like, let's say I didn't find the cancel button, and that's my way of like canceling subscription. Based on your experience, do you see any similar signals or similar experiences? Do you see that retries or maybe even aggressive retries can hurt customer experience and customer satisfaction from the service and increase the chargeback rate?
Yeah, so I think there's a few ways to kind of approach that. I think the first one is probably like if you do retries, and I think there's a distinction between like aggressive retries and just like healthy retries. Like that, I think is very, very important, first of all. So it's like there are people that'll just retry, and it's kind of what it's called, where they're just like bang, 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 bang. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that because like you're just without thought process, without anything. You're just trying to like, okay, let's just do 30 retries in the first day or something. Don't do that because one, you're gonna piss off like Visa and MasterCard. They have very clear rules where like, okay, only retry this amount, do not retry hard declines, like all these different things. Like so first off, from like a merchant ID health, like your payments, like you don't want to mess around with like doing it too aggressively. From a customer experience side, I think there's a few nuances here. So will retrying increase chargebacks? Like we haven't seen that correlated. I think there's nuances to that though, because there's maybe like some services where like the card descriptor, like they'll retry payments, but when that payment succeeds, it's not under like the merchant. So let's say like Amazon. If your Amazon payment fails and then they're able to recover it like 2 or 3 days later, it's going to show up as a normal Amazon transaction. Like there's no loss of service. You didn't know your card failed. A lot of these can be like retried silently under the scenes. Whereas if it's, for example, like you see some other transaction that's not Amazon on that like credit card descriptor, which does happen on like certain like retry solutions, that is going to potentially like cause some flags to be raised and the customers be like, I don't recognize this. What is this chargeback kind of thing? So like you want to make sure that when you are retrying, you're retrying it like on your own account and you're actually doing it in a way that like it looks as if it's just like a continuous or a continuity of service. The other side of that I think is like, oh, the customer intentionally didn't put funds on their account and then that payment failed. That's how they wanted to cancel that transaction. I think from our perspective and our philosophy, and kind of like what we've seen is it's hard to know the exact psychology of a customer. Like if you're a business, what you do know is that customer signed up for an account, which tells you as a signal that they want your service. And until they like actively cancel and say, hey, I do not want this anymore, and they raise their hand and actually cancel, which is why I think it's important for like not to go off on a tangent, but like the FTC one-click cancel. Like, I think that's a great idea. I think it should be very, very easy for someone to cancel whenever they don't want it. So you do want to make it easy to cancel. But like, as far as the failures and the retries, I don't think it's necessarily fair to assume like, oh, the customer doesn't want this, we're never going to retry this payment kind of thing. If that payment went through and they didn't want it, then they can go ahead and cancel it. And you can essentially know with 100% certainty that they wanted to cancel. Whereas in our data, what we see, whenever a payment is recovered, you're not getting a lot of chargebacks. You're not getting a lot of, I hate this. This is not what I wanted. They did sign up for this subscription. They are getting value out of it, generally speaking. What that tells us is that whenever we recover a transaction, we do see renewals on that transaction, whether it be 6 months or 12 months or whatever that number is. It varies company to company, but it's very rarely where it's like, okay, you recover and they want to cancel right away. Does it happen? Sure. But that's just a nuance of any business. The vast majority of subscribers that are being kicked out of these services prematurely do want that service and they end up going to a competitor. I think there's just a lot of value, especially from the business side, but like the customer still gets to maintain access to that subscription. They get to maintain all these additional services that they had initially subscribed for. And I think it's very difficult to ascribe meaning. They may have still wanted this, but now there's too much friction in the process. This is another alternative. What we see a lot is when a payment fails, the customer doesn't blame themselves, they blame you. And generally for good reasons. Like, okay, the customer sees it. I was like, oh, my card worked. I just made a purchase like 10 minutes ago. Why did it fail on this? Are you doing something sketchy as a business? Like, no, I'm going to go to somewhere that I trust. They lose trust in you if the card fails. And then they realize that it's like, okay, so if you can solve this problem silently behind the scenes, make sure they have continuity of service, there's no loss of trust in your service. There's just a lot of benefits to be had. Don't be spamming cards. Like that is definitely not the way, because it's less of it's a risk for the customer, but it's for like the customer perception, but it's more so a risk for like the your merchant health, your relationship with your processor or your bank or all these kind of like financial institutions. Like you don't want to do that. So you want to have like intelligent retries within like the terms of service that like are kind of outlined. The other side, if you can't really ascribe value, you can't ascribe meaning to like why that payment failed. If they really wanted to cancel, like they would go ahead and cancel as long as your cancellation policy is like one click or very easy to do so. Like that should be a priority in the business because like that also reduces chargebacks if you make it easy to cancel and they like, okay, this is how you cancel. Like you're not trying to hide anything. Like if they don't want it, make it easy for them to not have it, but don't assume they don't want it because the payment failed. I think that is the through line with that.
There is a startup called Mina Technologies. They were acquired by MasterCard. They provide solution for banks to do one-click subscription cancellation.
That's smart.
They see the payment, yeah, they can click cancel and cancel subscription right from there. Great place and kind of like a great tool for customer to cancel it. So I like we're moving in the industry in that direction. Let's maybe dive a little bit deeper into involuntary churn. We already mentioned that there could be kind of like different reasons, right, why payment could be canceled. Can be insufficient funds or like card expires, or maybe there are some others. Can you tell me more about maybe like statistics or like if you have like a pie chart in your head, kind of like what's the majority of decline reasons? And do you think the strategy should be different based on the decline reason? Or what strategy would you recommend to recover each payment for each decline reason?
Yeah, I think this is arguably one of the most exciting things happening in this space is the ability to tailor retry strategies around the error code that is returned. Whenever that payment fails, it's essentially a clue, a map on how to solve it. Whenever that payment fails, Visa, MasterCard, these two, they're going to return an error code. We talked about insufficient funds, generic decline, card loss, like dozens and dozens of error codes. Historically, how people would like retry these were just these like batch retry systems where it's like, okay, we had 1,000 failures this month. Let's just retry them on a 3-day, 5-day, 7-day fixed schedule. No nuance on anything, just like blasting away. You're going to recover some, but you're going to like not recover the vast majority because what we're finding is there's nuance required with each individual failure if you really want to maximize the probability that you recover these transactions. So how you treat an insufficient funds is going to be different than how you treat a generic decline. And that I think is where things get really, really interesting. Let's say you have a customer in New York City and that payment fails for insufficient funds. You're going to want to retry around 9 a.m. Eastern time on a Friday because that's coinciding with pay cycles and when that customer is more likely to have funds in their account. Whereas if you have a customer in Los Angeles, for example, you're going to want to retry that around 9 a.m. Pacific time on a Friday because that's when they have money in their account. But then take that a step further. Let's say that first transaction doesn't go through. Now you want to retry on the 1st of the month or the 15th of the month, again, coinciding with pay cycles. Now you want to retry around the next available business day where it's either the 2nd of the month or the 3rd of the month. And that's just like a very simplistic example of one specific error code for two types of customers. But then you take that logic and extrapolate that out across all the different error codes. And now you're creating custom recovery strategies that are very contextual to each individual failure type, each individual customer, that then you're also able to maximize the probability of recovery, the chance of recovery, while minimizing the actual attempts you do. Because again, historically, people are just like, okay, we're going to retry, trying to figure out when that goes through. That's not good. That has a lot of problems. You have the existing systems, which are currently like batch retries, where it's like, okay, group all the transactions together, fire them off, like 3-day, 5-day, 7-day. Okay, we can't get it. We're done. Like that leaves a lot of money on the table and is just kind of like not super targeted. And now you have this new age of AI powered, ML powered retries where you're able to look at large amounts of data, find the patterns on how these are approved, and draw nuances and conclusions to improve and maximize how much you can recover. And now you're starting to see higher recovery rates, which translates into more LTV, retention, and lower churn rates, and all these things that build a healthy business. But it can get essentially run behind the scenes, getting smarter all the time. And then you don't have to worry about that. You can kind of take that off your plate and then have more of the top of funnel, the growth, and focus on the levers that are going to drive more growth to your business as well. So it's just like, I find this stuff super, super interesting because there's a lot of cool technology coming out, a lot of cool things you can do around it. to then go well beyond what maybe was historically possible with kind of these like blunt force style systems.
Outside of retries, did you see any good examples of other recovery mechanisms? I believe I saw another startup who were outsourcing the call center, and they were calling every customer and asking the customer to update their payment method. That's kind of like a solution for subscription companies. Do you see any good examples of like how to fix involuntary churn, but outside of retries? Let's say if someone already exhausted all their options with retries and they think they're good, but there's still potential to recover some customers.
Yeah, so there's a couple different options depending like the easiest way up to like the more kind of complex way. So I guess the easiest way is just like send them an email, right? Like that's gonna if you have the basic like send them an email, hey, update your card information, this is the error that occurred, that sort of thing. That has pros and cons to it. I mean, any system has pros and cons. I think the pros are like you have a chance of increasing the recovery rate. The cons of that are you're alerting people to like, oh, that you're introducing, oh, like why is my payment? Like all these kind of questions around that. So I kind of like the philosophy around it. If we want the hierarchy of like recovery, right? Like start with the retries, try and recover what you can behind the scenes. You can recover a very large percentage of that. If you can't do that, then layer in like an email or an SMS or something like that. You've exhausted your retries. Now you want to layer in the customer outreach portion. You want to make that contextual. I think this is a key distinction that a lot of people don't do is you want to make that contextual to the error code type. So if it's like, okay, you have the error code, like most people just say, oh, your card failed, fix your card, like whatever. There's no nuance to that communication. But what you want to do is like be empathetic to the situation that customer's in. Like maybe they lost their card. So the issue that's returned is okay, this was a card failure that said card lost. Now you want to tailor your messaging. Hey, like I know there's a lot going on in your life. You may have lost your card. Just want to let you know, like if you want to keep the service, update your card here, kind of thing. And you tailor the messaging around essentially that failure or like that failure code to empathize with the customer as far as like this is what you're dealing with, we're here for you, like how can we kind of help? It's like again, you're here to help the customer, you're here to make their life easier, to smooth this process, because if you have a good product that people like, they want to use it, you want them to use it, like it's a win-win for everyone using your product kind of thing. Then there's this new age, there's these other things that you can do as far as orchestration. And this is like a whole nother animal altogether. But if you have multiple processing accounts open, like you have a Stripe, you have an Adyen, you have all these other ones, what you can also do is start routing transactions to the essentially where you're going to have a higher approval rate. So this is kind of what Stripe opened up at Stripe Sessions is they allowed you to now take a transaction off of Stripe and run it through other processors or other kind of payment gateways, which has historically not been possible. So this is a very, very interesting one. So like, let's say this is where you can get super, super granular, but like, let's say you have a card that fails for, I don't know, generic decline or whatever the error is. But you know that Visa cards do better on this processor or on Adyen or whatever that may be. You can now route these transactions intelligently to like, okay, you're going to have a higher authorization or a higher probability of this being approved on, I don't know, Adyen versus Stripe. So you send that transaction to Adyen and now you maybe get like a 5, 10, 15% boost in approvals on that specific transaction. So that is another piece of the puzzle. It does add more complexity to it. But again, if you're running millions of dollars in volume, or if you're running a lot of volume, any small percentage increase in approvals is going to have massive downstream effects. These numbers look small, a 5% boost here, a 20% boost here, but when it's millions and millions of dollars pumping through the system, that can really, really add up over time.
I think most of the examples we were talking about are for like regular monthly subscription service like Netflix, Spotify, or others. Do you see the same challenges for other types of billing types, like usage-based billing or maybe like quarterly or annual subscription companies? Is it like all the same, or there are any nuances based on how you bill as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, the broad strokes of how you solve it are the same. I do think there's potentially some nuances, whether it's an annual plan versus a usage-based billing. But as long as it's that kind of recurring charge where they maybe use 10% capacity, 20%, like they use some capacity this month for usage, and then it's like you're still on the recurring cycle where they're going to come back next month and the month after. You want to maintain that customer relationship. You want to recover that payment. That is going to be very different. And that's like a subscription as a whole is generally solved similarly. Then there's new solutions and things coming out for like the one-time transactions, which is still a very, very new industry. And I think there's a lot of learnings coming out of that. It's like, how do you solve the one-time transactions where it's like that payment fails on that first transaction? Because like if you're a subscription company, the reason retries work at the end of the day is because you do have access to that card data, whether it's tokenized or whatever the level of security, right? You have access to retry that card. You have the ability to route that transaction. And you also have a window in time where you can try more things to recover that transaction. So you have 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, whatever. With a one-time transaction, you need it like instantaneously. So how do you either route to the right processor? How do you figure out how to recover that transaction? And I think that is a very interesting problem that like we're thinking about, other people are thinking about, like how do you solve the one-time transaction issue? Because subscription billing, like that's a big problem. And it's like a multi-$100 billion problem of failures and things like that. You layer in that one-time failure transaction issue. That is very, very interesting. But I'd say generally to answer the question is like subscriptions, transactions are generally solved very similarly. The new style, like there's a new kind of thought process rationale about how do you solve one-time transactions. That's going to be done very differently than how you do a subscription recovery, for example.
You build the whole business around payments retries and to solve this specific problem. When I'm looking at the industry and I'm looking at the merchants who are providing subscription service, they're often use like a subscription platform, which is designed to kind of like manage plans, right? Manage customers, manage subscriptions, or they're using like a payment provider like Stripe, Adyen, or others. Both these solutions, like subscription platform or the payment provider, they also have some kind of flavor of the retry solution or a payment recovery. What do you do differently comparing to them? And basically, like, yeah, what's your secret sauce?
Yeah, I mean, I think the punchline on that is these subscription management platforms or these built-in solutions are one of many different products that these companies work on. Like it's never their main priority. They're also not super incentivized to juice recovery to the absolute max. And what I mean by that is like, okay, let's say you're on Stripe billing. Like this is a product that's made to work across millions and millions of businesses. Like it does a good job, make sure that payments are recovered. Like you recover a portion of your transactions or like a recurrently or a charge. It does a good job. I think that is where the distinction is though, where these are meant to work for millions and millions of businesses. It's not necessarily made to be optimized for your specific business. There's a lot of optimizations and tweaks and things that you can improve upon when you go a little bit more niche, look at a more nuanced approach where it's like, okay, you have this aggregate of data, but you can also look at this specific merchant and how can you optimize the performance for this person's customers, their geographic distribution, things like that. These tools exist. They recover a decent percentage of transactions, but what we're finding is there is a lot of alpha to be generated above these tools because we're taking a much more personalized approach. We're really looking at the nuances of each individual business. And also, we're very incentivized to solve this problem. Incentives drive behavior. We're purely on a performance basis where we'll come into a platform, look at 30% recovery rate, baseline that recovery rate, and then we'll have to beat your recovery rate in order for us to make money. So it's like what we're doing is we're trying to figure out how do we perform better than these platforms? How do we optimize our product specifically to your business so you can get the most revenue recovered while minimizing retry attempts and all these things. So it's just like, I think it really comes down to the nuance of focusing on a very specific business versus, okay, this is a tool, we made it to work for millions of businesses, it works, gets the job done, okay, let's move on to the next product, right? Like if you're a subscription management platform, your end goal at the end of the day is like, how do we solve subscriptions? How do we make it smooth? How do we make sure that all the customers get a very cohesive experience? You may not be a subject matter expert in payment recovery. You may be able to create something that gets some of their payments recovered, things like that. But you're never going to dive into the depth of solving this problem because you're not really incentivized to do so. Yes, your customers are going to make some money. Yes, they're going to recover. But if they recover 30% or 50%, does it really matter to you as much? Not really. As long as you're getting the job done and you have the payment recovery, let's put it on the marketing deck. Yep, we have AI retries, that sort of thing. Okay, then check that box and move on. Whereas all day, every day, all we think about is, okay, how do we do this? How do we optimize this? How do we move this small tweak, this small thing? That is where I think the performance kind of comes from, is when you can really start adjusting and tweaking to your business versus just using kind of like off the shelf logic. It is intelligent. It does tailor retries and things, but isn't specifically for your business.
You mentioned about like this personalization, right? For based on business types. If you can maybe expand more on this, what parameters you are taking as part of this personalization, and what exactly you're tweaking based on the industry or on their subscriber performance, and like what exactly the parameters you use, if you can share this.
Yeah. So a big one is geographic distribution. What percentage of your customers are going to be in Latin America versus the US versus the UK, and understanding how that differs? Because if you're retrying a payment in the US and you're hitting UK after hours, the approval rates on that transaction are going to be lower. So we do look at like, okay, this specific customer has a higher distribution of customers in this geographic area versus this geographic area. I think another big one as well is really just like, okay, there's a lot of generic declines, and generic declines or do not honor. Those are kind of like two of the catch-all kind of transactions. So Visa, MasterCard, they just say, okay, we don't really know why this failed, but go figure it out. So part of the game is even how do you decipher that out? Like, how do you figure out like, what is the actual error that occurred with that? And how do you break that apart and understand? So we're looking at how we've solved these in the past, the customer, their location, and what we've seen across other customers. Our data says we've had 80% probability of recovering this style of error in this geographic area using this style of retry. And then we apply that same logic. It was recovered or wasn't recovered. And then we adjust that for the next time. Now we're at an 87% recovery for this. It's kind of learning off of exactly like what was done in the past to inform future decisions, but also using decisions to inform future recovery.
So you're looking basically at the retry performance and optimizing the model based on the data you're seeing at the current time. And basically there is no fixed model. It's constantly evolving based on the data, what you see. Is it right?
Yeah, it's very adaptive. It's constantly like, how do we make it 1% better, 2% better? How do we like constantly make it better? Oh, this didn't work. Okay, we're not going to do that. We're going to try and implement this. You're constantly just trying to see like what is working, what's not working in the space. How do you get the most recovery out of it? Even a 1%, 2% increase that compounds over time. The smallest increases do stack up over time, and that's kind of what you're looking for.
Okay, let's chat about a higher level payments topics. We touched a little bit on this, but what do you think is the most exciting right now? What's happening in the industry from the subscription payments perspective? Something that you're specifically excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, like if I wasn't excited about the AI powered retries and things like that, I wouldn't have built a company around that. I think that is very, very interesting, very compelling. Obviously biased on that, but even just like I think there's a lot of cool things like Stripe is working on. And then like the orchestration side, like them opening up that, allowing other processors and other companies to access those payments. I think that is going to open up an entirely new world, because historically these transactions have been tokenized and gated within Playground or their sandbox, but now they've opened it up. So it's like, okay, what is going to happen with that? Like, what technologies are going to be built around that? And like, how can you use that to optimize for more approval rates and things like that? So I think that kind of area of orchestration and AI powered retries and all of these things, from involuntary churn recoveries, I think that is going to be really cool over the next few years. That's what excites me, and seeing where that ball is going in the direction around all these different things. If you can really solve your involuntary churn issue, the playbook is largely written for voluntary churn. It's like, have a good product, make sure your optimization flows are good, make sure your onboarding experience is good, make sure you're not making false promises in your advertising. There's this entire other world of involuntary churn. It sounds very technical, it sounds very scary, but there's a lot that you can do that allows you to really improve your recovery rates kind of behind the scenes, and really juice the amount of money you can recover. That I think is what really excites me, is this new involuntary churn side of things is becoming more apparent. It's becoming something that people are adding into their vocabulary and starting to distinct between the two. Involuntary churn as a category, however you solve that, there's going to be lots of ways to solve it. But the fact that people are starting to solve it and playbooks are starting to be written, that is what I'm very, very excited about.
And maybe finally, the question I ask everybody: what is your like very practical advice to the merchant who are looking to improve their payments performance? So basically, what's the maybe less obvious advice you can give to everybody who are like, hey, we're not sure where we are with payments, but we think we can do better?
Yeah, I mean, I think step one is just like know your failed payment recovery rate. Like, what are you doing with failed payments? Because I think we go in, like, we audit hundreds of accounts, and like a lot of times, just people are like don't do much with failed payments. Like, they don't have logic set up, or it's very, very basic, or they just have no knowledge around like, hey, this is even a problem. So I think step one is just like understand this is something that you have control over. This is a lever you can pull, and it can have pretty large effects on it. Beyond that, I think it's just like understand that there's like, okay, you want to first recover transactions without talking to your customers. You want to, there's a lot of retries that can happen behind the scenes. I think there's the much better way is use the silent recovery behind the scenes, recover as many payments as you can, which is going to be a very large percentage, then layer in communication, then layer in emails, then layer in SMS. I think dunning is what people just default to. So, oh, we're just turn on dunning, we're done. No, you should implement recovery behind the scenes first. You're going to recover a ton of transactions. Now you're sending less emails, less SMS, bothering the customer less with like, oh, update your card information, stuff like that. I think that should be the first step one. Understand what you're doing. Like, what are you doing? Understand what you can do, and then understand from there, like, okay, make sure it's behind the scenes, then implement the active recovery. If there's more that you have questions on, reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn at Philip Pages, Philip at reduxpayments.com. I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. This is the world I operate in. I love this stuff. Like, I geek out on this. So if anyone ever wants to chat, just hit me up. You want me to audit your account and look at that? Like, I can do that as well.
That's perfect. It's been very, very interesting conversation.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Bye.